The $30 billion lie. Why China's Three Gorges Dam will fail sooner than you think. Sirens are already screaming downstream when the monitors spike. The reservoir is climbing faster than the forecast curve, and a hairline crack along Spillway Gate 17 is humming at a frequency the model never predicted. Shut it, someone says, but the command center hangs on the next breath. They're not just managing water, they're managing politics, power, and a promise worth $30 billion. Tens of millions live on floodplains that assume this moment never comes. Factories, ports, and a grid stitched across provinces depend on it. Warnings were sidelined, geology bargained with, and a design trade-off buried deep. To understand this hesitation, we need to go back to the river that wouldn't be tamed. The river that defied empires. The Yangtze has always run on its own clock. In spring, it rises on snowmelt and mountain rain. In summer, monsoon pulses turn valleys into inland seas. It carries silt thick as soup, grinding mountains into plains, building and erasing shorelines with the patience of stone. Civilization grew along its edges precisely because it was generous and brutal. In 1931, the river taught a lesson nobody forgot. A convergence of monsoon rains, snowmelt, and typhoons turned the middle and lower Yangtze into a catastrophe. Cities drowned, crops vanished, disease arrived with the heat. Estimates of the dead run into the millions. The trauma imprinted itself on policy, memory, and a recurring vow: never again. Then in 1998, the river pressed the issue. Weeks of relentless rains swelled the basin. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder on failing levees, passing sandbags into the night. The flood crested, and even where the walls held, the message landed. The infrastructure was aging, the floodplain was crowded, and the weather was growing more volatile. The modern state needed an answer big enough to bend a river. The idea wasn't new. Sun Yat-sen had sketched a vision of a massive Yangtze Dam in the early 20th century, a symbol of a future tuned to modern power. Mao picked up the dream, calling for mastery over nature itself, but the science and the economy weren't ready. Preliminary surveys made it clear. This wasn't just an engineering challenge, it was geology on hard mode. The gorge walls were steep, the faults were real, and the river transporting enough sediment each year to bury cities. Still, the argument was seductive. A dam could flatten the flood peaks, power industrial ascent, and become a national icon. Downstream sat some of the densest clusters of people and industry on Earth: Wuhan, Zhejiang, Nanjing, and further east the engines of export. Upstream, the watershed stitched together plateaus and mountains that shed rain in violent bursts. The promise was simple. One structure, carefully operated, could arbitrate between abundance and disaster. But rivers don't sign contracts. The Yangtze's meanders cut at their own pace. Hill slopes watch silently for excuses to move. Fault splays thread through bedrock like hidden seams. Sediment doesn't negotiate, it settles where physics tells it to. Engineers know this, and still they build, betting that design, monitoring, and management can box chaos into acceptable bounds. To understand the technical gamble, you have to see the land. Badong and Zigui sit where hills meet water in precarious geometry. Even before the reservoir, slides scarred the banks. After impoundment, pore pressures change, and slopes that slept for centuries can wake. Far downstream, the river's load builds deltas and bars that shift navigation channels overnight. Each intervention solves a problem and creates new ones. A narrower channel might speed flow here and scour a bank there. A levee protects one town and pushes water to the next. Humans took the bargain anyway. The downstream floodplain isn't a blank map. It's power plants, logistics hubs, chemical parks, neighborhoods stacked along ring roads. The Yangtze Delta feeds industries that feed the world. When a storm parks over Sichuan, the outcome can affect a car factory in Europe weeks later. Flood control became more than hydrology, it became supply chain insurance. That's why the memory of 1931 and 1998 mattered. They weren't just disasters, they were arguments. Every time a levee groaned, the political calculus sharpened. A dam at the Three Gorges could store floodwater, shave the peak off the hydrograph, release power on schedule, and prove that a state could deliver safety at scale. The story almost wrote itself. The river that defeated emperors would be enlisted into national rejuvenation. Yet the geology was whispering terms. The gorges cut through layered, weathered rock, with karst pockets and fractured zones that don't behave like drawings. Seismicity in the region isn't headline-grabbing, but stresses shift over time, especially under the weight and drawdown of a giant reservoir. Sediment from the upper basin would pile into the still water, advancing a delta like a slow-moving landslide, quietly eating the storage space meant for floods. And the climate backdrop was already tilting. Teleconnections, those distant climate relationships, were nudging rainfall patterns. Some years, the basin saw longer dry spells punctured by violent bursts. Other years, the monsoon seemed to arrive with a sharper edge. Design hydrology gives you a number, the river gives you a distribution with fat tails. So the stakes formed, a promise of control versus the complexity of nature. The Yangtze offers power, food, and passage, but on terms that change. Any attempt to tame it must wrestle with uncertain rain, stubborn rock, and the unglamorous physics of mud. The dam would rise anyway, because the country decided that risk could be engineered, monitored, and managed. On paper, the plan made sense. In stone, steel, and water, it became a question: how much certainty can you pour into a river before the river asks for it back? Politics locked the blueprint. After 1998, the dream stopped being a dream. It became a deadline. Mastery over nature wasn't just a slogan, it was part of the state's legitimacy. Factories needed reliable power. Coastal cities needed proof that flood maps could be redrawn by decree. And at the center sat a project large enough to bind engineering to ideology. If the river could be disciplined, then the story of national rejuvenation wasn't just rhetoric, it had concrete. Inside Beijing's halls, the case sounded airtight. One dam would tame floods, light up the grid, and stand as a monument to capability. But in 1992, when the National People's Congress took the vote, it wasn't a rubber stamp. Dissent rippled through committees. Hydrologists asked about sediment. Geologists flagged fault splays and slope stability. Economists asked what 1 million displaced people meant in practice. The vote passed, but the margins told a quieter truth. Even insiders could see the risks. That mattered, then it was smoothed over. The headline was unity. From that day, politics shaped the blueprint as much as physics. The relocation math became a moral test. More than 1 million residents would leave homes, fields, and grave. Compensation formulas changed by province and year. Some families moved into apartments with thin walls and thinner prospects. Others waited years for promised jobs. Local cadres managed the lists, and the lists controlled futures. Complaints filtered up, approvals filtered down. The project marched on. Messaging handled the friction. State media showcased scale, the world's biggest turbines, the tallest ship lifts, the widest spillways. Flood control was presented as certainty, not probability. Objections were framed as pessimism or worse. Scientists who asked hard questions found their conference panels reassigned. A few wrote cautiously in technical journals about sediment and bank stability. Those papers lived behind paywalls and acronyms. The public story stayed simple. The river would obey. Procurement timelines rewarded speed. Contracts bundled civil works, electromechanical packages, and navigation upgrades into overlapping phases. The clock pushed everything forward. When testing windows narrowed, teams leaned on modeling. When suppliers missed specs, inspectors weighed delay against headlines. Scope crept. More turbines now, ship locks integrated sooner, a showpiece elevator later. Costs blurred. Accounting distinguished state investment from bank lending and local contributions, and the totals moved like water under glare. Inside technical committees, trade-offs hardened. Flood control needs volume, empty space to catch the crest. Power output prefers a full head, high reservoir levels drive turbines. Sediment flushing wants low pools and strong throughflow at precise times. You can't maximize all three. The operating rules tried to split the difference, hold high for the grid, draw down before the wet season, flush when you can. The politics of light staying on pulled the lever one way. The river's mud pulled back. Meanwhile, the relocation story kept echoing. County by county, villages vanished under the pool. Cultural sites were catalogued, moved, or left. An elderly couple returned by boat each year to where their house once stood, tossing flowers where the door had been. Micro-stories like theirs didn't fit the national broadcast, but traveled in quiet conversations. They weren't a counter-argument, they were a cost the blueprint had priced in. Deadlines created their own gravity. The first generator had to spin on schedule. Each milestone carried a parade of cameras. Contractors learned what mattered: visible progress. Thermal cracking controls got their due, but only what inspections could see. Quality met the letter. Questions that required time, long-term creep, uplift variability, instrumentation density, competed with calendars. What couldn't be measured quickly drifted to monitor and manage later. By the early 2000s, descent adapted. You couldn't stop the dam, you could shape operation. Hydrologists argued for conservative pre-release before heavy rain. Provincial leaders downstream argued the opposite. Pre-release meant higher risk for their cities if the forecast missed. The Meteorological Bureau was improving, but the political cost of being wrong grew with every new riverside apartment block. The safer move, institutionally, was to trust the model and keep the pool where the power planners wanted it. On paper, it balanced. In practice, it narrowed the margin. What nobody admitted openly was the feedback loop. State assurance made developers confident. Confidence built new districts closer to risk. New districts raised the stakes for avoiding visible floods. Higher stakes pushed operators to avoid pre-releases that might scare markets or trigger evacuations. Less pre-release meant less cushion when rain arrived fast. The blueprint locked politics into hydrology. International optics added another layer. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was a calling card. Foreign delegations toured galleries of photographs showing sunrise over turbines. Belt and road pitches nodded to domestic prowess. Admitting uncertainty would chip at the export narrative. So the language hardened, resilient, safe, controlled. The river listened, indifferent. Inside the control room, that indifference showed up as numbers. Reservoir-level targets became political commitments. Deviate too far and phones rang. Safety protocols existed, but the chain of command was crowded. A cautious operator needed cover to take heat early. The cover depended on forecasts, and forecasts depended on patterns that were getting less reliable. The gray area widened. The will to act boldly in gray shrank. By the time the last concrete cured, the blueprint was more than rebar and gates. It was a governance system. It said, we can fix risk with scale, and we can manage complexity with messaging. It pushed uncertainty into the future and called it progress. The river kept its own counsel. The engineering compromises. On the drawings, the answer was mass. A gravity dam holds back water not by clever geometry, but by being heavier than the force pushing on it. Stack concrete thick enough, anchor it into rock, and let weight do the work. At Three Gorges, that meant monoliths, block after block jointed together, each keyed into the next, each riding on a foundation that wasn't uniform. On the left abutment, the rock was harder, more intact. On the right, weathered layers and fracture zones needed stitching. The design assumed the average would behave. Foundations never behave on average. Spillways became the lungs. When the river surges, you bleed energy through gates and chutes. But that water isn't gentle. High-velocity jets tear at surfaces, pull vapor bubbles into existence, and those bubbles collapse like hammers. Cavitation. Engineers added aerators to lift the nap, to mix air and water so the collapse happens in fluid, not against concrete. It's a fine balance. Too little air and the surface pits. Too much and the jet destabilizes, chewing at sidewalls and flipping into vibrations that travel into hinges and hoists. The gate you count on to save you becomes the thing that bites you. Sediment forced another uneasy truce. The reservoir's job in flood season is storage, but storage is what sediment steals. The Yangtze brings a moving mountain every year. If you hold the pool high to feed turbines, the river slows and drops its load. If you lower the pool to flush, you give up power and risk alarming downstream cities with sudden releases. The operating rule curves set windows for scouring flows, short pulses aimed at sweeping density currents along the bottom without shocking the estuary with silt. In practice, windows close, forecasts shift. Politics prefers a full lake, mud prefers still water. Below the surface, uplift pressures lurk. Water finds paths. Even with grout curtains, those subsurface barriers injected into fractures, pressure can build under the dam's heel. Relief wells and drainage galleries bleed it off, but coverage is never total and geology changes under load. Piezometers tell you how the pressure field moves, but they're point voices in a noisy choir. Designers accept some uncertainty because you have to. Operators inherit it. Concrete itself is alive on slow timescales. Pour a block, and heat blooms from the curing. Differential temperatures try to crack it apart. They embedded cooling pipes, sequenced pores, and cut expansion joints to control where the structure would open and close as seasons and loads cycled. It's good practice, but creep, the long-term deformation under sustained stress, doesn't send alerts. You see it in millimeters over years, in joints that move a little more than the model expected, in seals that need replacing sooner than the maintenance plan assumed. Value engineering started as prudence and slipped, occasionally, toward deferral. A thicker abrasion-resistant lining on spillway chutes buys you time against cavitation pitting, but it's expensive up front. More instruments mean richer data, but also more alarms to interpret. Redundancy in hoist motors looks like overkill until a gate binds under asymmetric flow. Every committee meeting weighed costs against probabilities, and the project was already the size of a small country's GDP. Savings today, inspections tomorrow. The turbines wanted head. Francis, runners the size of houses peak when the reservoir sits high. That's great for the grid and for the narrative of abundance. But a high pool shortens the drawdown margin before the wet season. Hydrologists pushed for lower targets heading into June. Power planners eyed summer peaks and air conditioning load. The compromise lived in narrow bands and hopeful forecasts. When the monsoon arrived early, the margins felt thin. One choice echoed. The spillway capacity had to meet a design flood statistic, big but statistical. Boosting that capacity beyond the number costs concrete, steel, and space that could have housed more turbines. They built for the event they believed they'd see, knowing that outliers exist. On rare days, rare math becomes real water, and the jets carve at everything in their way. Those days were treated as out of scope because scope has a budget. Maintenance was the quiet ledger. Cavitation pits get patched with epoxy and resurfacing, gates get new seals, welds on trunnions get inspected for hairline cracks that grow under fatigue. But you can't pull too many gates offline at once without risking flood readiness, and you can't stop turbines during peak demand without inviting uncomfortable questions. Deferred overhauls accumulate. Small vibrations turn into signatures you can recognize if you're listening and empowered to act on what you hear. Every system leaned on another. Grout curtains rely on drainage galleries that rely on access schedules, that rely on reservoir levels, that rely on forecasts, that rely on a climate baseline sliding underfoot. The engineering wasn't sloppy, it was bounded. It assumed coordination would be crisp, data would be clear, and trade-offs would be revisited as the river taught new lessons. Some were, others waited behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the mountains were changing. Impoundment altered stress fields, shorelines softened, slides trimmed the edges of storage. The dam's mass did what it was meant to do, but the environment around it kept asking new questions. Each answer cost time, money, and political capital, and the ledger wasn't just technical, it was public confidence. The water waited, the machines hummed, the concrete cooled and warmed with the seasons. On most days, the compromises held. On some nights, the instruments hinted at their price. Geology doesn't sign NDAs. The drawings called it competent rock. Field notes told a messier story. The gorge is carved into layered sandstones, shales, and occasional limestone seams riddled with karst pockets, voids you don't meet until grout disappears into them like a magician's scarf. Fault splays cross the valley at angles that look tidy on maps and complicated in 3 dimensions. Weathered zones feather into stronger beds, and the contact lines don't stay put when you flood them with billions of tons of water. Karst is the kind of problem that smiles politely during construction and clears its throat later. Dissolution cavities, infilled with clay or silt, behave fine under light load and then deform subtly when pore pressure rises. Grout curtains stitch many of them shut, but not all. Water seeks the path of least resistance, and under a fluctuating reservoir, that path can change season by season. Piezometers whisper the trend. Operators must decide whether a whisper is enough to change operations that affect provinces. Slope stability came with its own clock. The names Badong Zigui are shorthand for hills that want to move. Before impoundment, slides scarred the banks after big rains. After impoundment, the mechanics changed. Raise the reservoir and you buoy slopes, reducing effective stress, draw it down fast, and you take that support away. The first years brought a rash of bank failures, narrow tongues slumping into coves, broader masses ratcheting downslope by centimeters that turned to meters. Engineers armored key reaches, but the shoreline is long. Every meter of protection is a budget line. Every unprotected niche waits for an excuse. Reservoir-induced seismicity added a new layer of uncertainty. The region isn't the Himalayas, but it isn't still. Filling, holding, and releasing a deep pool rewaits the crust. Microquakes prickle along old weaknesses as friction resets. Most pass unnoticed, a scatter of dots on local seismographs. But the pattern matters. A small event beneath a slope already strained by drawdown can be the tap that starts a slide. A moderate quake during a high pool complicates everything. Overtopping margins shrink, and spillway use spikes when sidewalls least want shock. Then there are landslide-generated waves, the impulse loads nobody wants to test live. 100,000 cubic meters of hillside hitting water at speed throws a wall that runs at the dam like a sprint. You don't need the whole mountain to go. A single block on a steep inlet can trigger a wave train that punishes shore infrastructure and climbs farther up the face than models like to imagine. You can fence, drain, and monitor, and still an unremarkable rain on an unremarkable Tuesday moves a seam you thought would sleep. Sediment, meanwhile, kept slipping the schedule. The delta advancing from upstream doesn't arrive as a neat wedge. It's a labyrinth of channels, bars, and density currents that hug the bottom like a cold breath. Those underflows snake along the reservoir floor and stall where slope and velocity falter, dropping a stealthy layer that wasn't in last year's survey. Tributary mouths clog. Backwater effects creep upstream, drowning farmland that wasn't supposed to be inundated at that elevation. Operators promise a flush. Storms 3 provinces away rearrange the chance. What nobody knew at the time, because nobody could, was how far the fractures talk to each other under variable load. Lab tests on cores give strengths, permeabilities, angles. Out in the gorge, a fracture you grouted at one depth might connect diagonally to a weathered seam you never touched. Raise the pool and pressure frontiers expand into those networks. Hold it high and clays soften. Drop it quickly and suction pulls in fines that clog drains you need open. The system learns you, then reacts. The land answered with micro-stories. A farmer above a narrow cove heard a low groan one night, like a truck on a far road. By dawn, a slice of hillside had settled by half a meter, tilting trees like parade flags. A ferry pilot steering across the pool felt a set of standing waves no forecast had predicted, born from a slide around a bend he couldn't see. A maintenance crew in a drainage gallery logged seepage that tasted faintly of clay, fine particles migrating where clear water used to run. Meanwhile, rainfall patterns shifted. Convective storms dumped harder in shorter windows, spiking the reservoir faster and testing the drawdown rates that keep slopes calm. El Niño years stretched dry seasons long enough to tempt higher holds for power. La Niña seasons snapped back with pulses that left little time to stage a controlled release. The operating curve became a tightrope. Lower too early and you risked downstream stress without real rain. Lower too late, and you loaded the banks just before the sky opened. Geology doesn't warn in headlines. It taps a joint here, widens a seam there, moves 1,000 unseen grains in a drain you'll only measure next quarter. It's not sabotage, it's response. The dam's mass answers with stoic predictability. The valley answers with creativity. And the instruments in between, the inclinometers creeping, the strain gauges drifting, the gate sensors picking up a vibration signature that doesn't match last year, are the only translators both sides share. By the time the project matured, everyone had learned one rule: the mountain keeps the last word. And just as that lesson settled, the rain started changing its grammar. Climate whiplash hits the reservoir. 3 summers in a row, the pattern refused to repeat. One year, rain came in stepped bursts, dry weeks, then a night of thunder that filled tributaries like flipping a switch. The next, the monsoon stalled, then sprinted late, dumping a month's water in 6 days. Operators stared at hydrographs that looked like heart attacks. The rule curves on paper were smooth. The sky was jagged. Intensifying extremes weren't theory anymore. Warmer air held more moisture and released it in convective storms that built high and dumped hard. Up in the Hengduan and along the Sichuan Basin's rim, Cells blossomed with heat and terrain lift, turning valley floors into funnels. Meanwhile, longer droughts stretched shoulder seasons, drawing down soil moisture and making the first storm after dry spell run off faster. The reservoir saw flashier inflows, less gentle ramps, more cliffs. Design hydrology had given the dam a probable maximum flood to plan against, a disciplined statistic meant to capture the worst plausible storm. But the debate had been about what plausible meant in a warming climate that hadn't held still. PMP curves built from mid-century records didn't map cleanly onto a present where tail events kept getting fatter. Hydrologists in quiet meetings argued for revising the design envelope. Planners worried that rewriting the envelope meant rewriting the promise. Upstream, new dams added a twist. Cascade projects on tributaries captured and retimed flows, shaving some peaks, but also altering sediment delivery and delaying freshets by hours or days. On some storms, that buffering bought breathing room. On others, synchronized releases and spillovers put pulses on top of pulses. Land use shifts compounded it. Forests swapped for roads and rooftops in booming basins sent rain straight into channels. The catchment's memory shortened. Heat worked another angle. Glaciers were small players here, but snowpack in the far headwaters and high plateau mattered. Warmer springs cut snow storage and accelerated melt, stacking more water into early summer just as the first convective storms lit up. The mixture raised the base flow entering the reservoir, so each storm started higher on the curve. The room to maneuver shrank. All of this bent operations into harder shapes. The rule was simple in theory: pre-release before big rain, hold back during peaks, refill judiciously. In practice, pre-release became politics. Drop the pool too early on a forecast that busts, and downstream leaders field angry calls when riverwalks go underwater under clear skies. Don't drop it, and a week later, when a stalled front trains rain over sub-basin, you're pushing gates to keep from overrunning your own design. The safest choice from one vantage point was the riskiest from another. One June, a compound event showed how fast slack disappears. A week of humid buildup primed the basin. Then a low-level jet fed moisture into a stationary boundary draped along the mountains. Storm after storm tracked the same line, a conveyor of rain. Tributaries surged at different times, creating a staircase of inflows that never let operators settle. They drew down overnight, but convective pop-ups refilled what they'd just shed by morning. Satellite loops looked like a dance. The reservoir read it as pressure. Meanwhile, the energy market tugged. Hotter nights meant air conditioners stayed on. Power planners asked for a higher head to keep turbines efficient through the heat wave. Operators balanced grid calls against a forecast that kept whispering maybe. Pre-release too much and blackouts hit cities already sweating. Hold too high and the next cell could shove you into spillway regimes you'd rather save for true emergencies, with jets that vibrate gates you wanted to nurse through summer. The trade-offs weren't abstract. Drawdown rates that protect slopes are measured in centimeters per day. Flood operations wanted meters. Move too fast, and you risked peeling a bank somewhere upstream, sending a wave back at your own face. Move too slow, and the lake climbed into a band where every extra 10 centimeters felt like a dare. Instrumentation helped, but timing outran data. Radar nowcasting caught formations an hour out, not day-long totals. Ensemble forecasts offered probabilities that didn't translate neatly into policy. Do you drop a meter on a 30% chance of a 50-year storm? Whose finger signs that order? The chain of command preferred certainty. The atmosphere offered odds. By late summer, a new normal had settled in, live in compression. The operating window squeezed by climate on one side and expectations on the other. Every decision carried reputational freight. A cautious move could be framed as panic. A bold hold could look like competence, unless the storm pivoted at midnight. Then came a night when it did. Dry spells had stretched for weeks. The pool kept high for power shimmered in heat. Thunder rumbled beyond the ridge, then lingered. Cells stacked. Inflows jumped in tiers, first 10,000 cubic meters per second, then 15, then 25. The model said crest at dawn. At midnight, it was already there. Screens blinked with numbers that didn't fit last year's logic. Someone reached for the pre-approved playbook. Someone else checked the phone, waiting for permission that didn't arrive. That hesitation wasn't new. It was baked in by a decade of whiplash, by a climate that moved the target while the promise stayed still. The reservoir didn't care who was on shift. It cared about gravity and rain. And before the hour was out, the operators would learn whether the margins they'd been living inside were real or just lines they'd been hoping the weather would respect. The data problem: what was measured, what was hidden. In the galleries behind the monoliths, instruments never sleep. Piezometers jab into the foundation, reading pore pressure in kilopascals. Inclinometers trace tiny tilts in abutments. Strain gauges on spillway piers register micro stretches you only see if you zoom to the fourth decimal. The network looks dense on a diagram, but coverage is a patchwork, rich around critical joints, sparse where budgets and time ran thin. A missing sensor isn't just an empty dot. It's a blind spot that turns a trend into a guess. Up top, gate gearboxes carry their own ears. Accelerometers on trunnions and hoist beams translate vibration into spectra, peaks that say normal turbulence, sidebands that mutter unbalanced load, and new notes that don't belong. After seasons of cavitation and hurried resurfacing, Gate 17's signature picked up a faint harmonic near a resonance the designers never expected to hit in flood mode. It wasn't loud. It was consistent. Maintenance logged it. Operations logged the silence that followed. Beyond the concrete, satellites watched. INSAR passes stitched together millimeter-scale motion across the face and abutments, a time-lapse of the dam breathing with seasons and water weight. Most of it fit the model: winter contraction, summer swell, small recoveries after drawdown. But a narrow band near the right non-overflow blocks showed a drift that didn't fully unwind after the last cycle. Independent analysts flagged it with caveats. Atmospheric noise can spoof a signal, processing choices can warp baselines. Still, the pattern lingered. Official bulletins told a calmer story. During the 2020 floods, operators announced elastic deformation within safety limits, a phrase that covers everything and explains nothing. When social media posts showed satellite imagery with wavy-looking alignments, state media called it lens distortion and sloppy analysis. Experts stepped forward to say the dam's design anticipates small shifts that revert when loads ease. They weren't wrong. They also weren't addressing the outliers that weren't reverting quite enough. Meanwhile, on nights with fast inflows, towns downstream felt surprise. Alerts mentioned routine releases, but riverwalks drowned at 2 a.m., and shopkeepers found mud lines where warnings hadn't suggested they'd be. AIS tracks showed barges clustered at odd hours, skippers idling to ride out pulses that hadn't been in the public plan. On chat apps, screenshots of dispatch sheets circulated, turbine gate openings, spillway sequences, timestamps in red. By morning, those images vanished under a wave of deletions. The river told its own truth. The feeds tried to tidy it. Inside, some alarms were throttled by design. If every gauge could page a supervisor at 3 a.m., nobody would sleep. So thresholds were set to suppress noise. A gate vibration had to exceed amplitude X for Y minutes to escalate. A drainage gallery seepage rate had to cross a slope-adjusted baseline to trigger a call. It kept sanity in the control room. It also smoothed over the kind of early, subtle drift that only looks urgent in hindsight. Data politics crept in through spreadsheets. Daily dashboards went to provincial leaders and Beijing. Colors mattered. Green meant normal, yellow meant explain this, red meant meetings with too many nameplates. Engineers learned the art of the note. Transient during gate transition, returned to baseline post-aeration. Accurate, defensible, and incomplete if your baseline was walking. External eyes kept poking. University teams compared river gauge records downstream against announced discharge. The curves didn't always match. A gap here could be travel time, backwater, wind. A gap there at night, repeated on storm weeks, looked like deliberate smoothing. Insurance analysts pulled rainfall radar, upstream hydrographs, and port operations data for correlations. The market prefers patterns. The basin delivered exceptions. One hard detail kept circling back: gate vibration spectra. In an internal seminar, a technician overlaid last year's flood signature on this year's. The new plot had a double peak, a telltale of asymmetric flow hitting the leaf in 2 pulses. Maybe a cavitation bubble train had carved a shallow pocket. Maybe a hinge pin was wearing unevenly. Either way, the fix wanted a lane closure and a resin pour the width of a living room. Flood season doesn't forgive lane closures. So the note went in: monitor closely, Defer overhaul to shoulder season. But shoulder seasons kept shrinking under climate whiplash and maintenance windows slipped. Deferred work stacked like driftwood behind a pier. Operators, knowing what was on the list, trimmed operations to avoid the worst regimes. Fewer gates opened together. Shorter high-velocity runs. Fine, until inflow outpaced caution. The divergence between what was measured and what was shown had a human reason. Fear of overreacting, fear of embarrassment, faith in redundancy. It wasn't a conspiracy so much as a culture that valued tidy narratives over messy probabilities. Still, information control has a cost. A missed memo becomes a misread trend. A misread trend becomes a surprise. Meanwhile, satellites kept passing, gauges kept writing numbers no one would read until morning, and phone cameras kept catching midnight water where warnings said it shouldn't be. The system had data. The system also had silence. And between the two lived the decisions that would matter when the inflow graphs spiked faster than the permission to act. Micro stories from the floodplain. While the instruments argued with themselves, people downstream made simpler calculations, what to move first and what to let the water take. In Wuhan, a factory manager named Liu watched the power dispatch app like it was a stock ticker. Rolling curtailments meant shifting production to graveyard hours, then back to afternoons with an hour's notice. He could ride a slowdown, he couldn't ride a flood. The warehouse sat 2 blocks from a riverwalk turned tourist strip. When a midnight, routine release pushed the gauge a half-meter above the public forecast, forklifts rolled in the dark. Workers taped plastic around pallets of precision molds that hated humidity. He called a trucking broker. Every driver had the same answer. Wait an hour, maybe 2, the current is wrong. Liu had a choice: burn cash on generators that might stall anyway, or lose a client that didn't tolerate delays. He chose the generator and texted the buyer a photo of glowing assembly lines as proof of life. By morning, the fuel was gone, and the river had receded just enough to leave a stain at the loading dock, a brown watermark on a promise. Upstream near Jiujiang, Mrs. Chen stared at corn that should have been tall enough to shade her knees. Backwater from the reservoir's elevated pool had crept into low fields twice that year, not a dramatic flood, just a slow insistence. The second time, it arrived after a rumor of a drawdown that never came. She'd stacked sacks around a pump that coughed, then died when silt clogged the intake. The harvest she counted on to pay a grandson's school fees turned into a patchwork of rot and salvage. When county carders came to register losses, they measured with a tape and a phone, tapping numbers into a form that didn't include the water returned at night. She showed them the line on the brick wall where damp turned to moss. They nodded and said the compensation would clear after the quarter. She dried kernels on the road shoulder and learned the exact sound of tires crunching near her life spread thin. On a clear morning, a relocated family rented a skiff and motored out to where their village had been. The father, Mr. He, counted seconds after the engine cut, letting the boat drift. He knew exactly where the kitchen had faced east, where a plum tree used to drop fruit onto the path. He tossed chrysanthemums into green water and told his daughter how the river smelled when it was just a river, not a lake. The girl asked why the water was so still. He didn't say that stillness sometimes meant pressure upstream or that his mother's grave was somewhere beneath this calm. They sat in silence until a barge wake nudged the boat. On shore, they'd been given an apartment with clean tiles and a view of another block. The government called their move progress. In the skiff, it felt like subtraction. Down on a channel near Anqing, a river pilot named Cairo guided a convoy past a silt bar that hadn't existed last season. His charts were annotated in pencil and coffee stains. The river moved faster than updates did. The depth sounder spoke in jittery beeps as density currents slid along the bottom, cold and opaque. He radioed a warning that the North Bend was shoaling. A junior captain laughed and said his app showed 6 meters. Cairo throttled back, felt the hull shudder, and slipped the bow into a tongue of faster water hugging the outside bank. The wake peeled off like torn paper. Hours later, AIS would show 2 barges stuck where his pencil mark had been. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired of the river's new habit of changing answers mid-sentence. At City Hall in a mid-sized municipality, Planner Joe stared at a map layered with routes in yellow and red. Evacuation paths crossed underpasses that ponded in heavy rain. He could order a drill, but drills sent the wrong message on a weekend when the leadership wanted headlines about a new waterfront plaza. He drafted 2 memos, one recommending a quiet nighttime test of pumps, another requesting permission to pre-stage buses on high ground. The first was approved with a smiley emoji. The second came back with a question about optics. He knew the rule, don't spook people unless you have to. He also knew that alarms are easier to mock when the sirens end with sunshine. These lives weren't footnotes to a dam. They were the ledger where its margins appeared as missed shifts, wet grain, boat wakes, and unsigned memos. When numbers on screens shifted upstream, they echoed here as choices that didn't fit into tidy dashboards. And while the operators argued with probabilities, the floodplain kept living with outcomes. Sediment, the slow knife. Sediment doesn't roar, it whispers, and then one morning you realize the room has filled with sand. Upstream, the Yangtze grinds mountains into fines and gravel. In a free river, that load builds bars and nourishes deltas. In a reservoir, it parks. The Three Gorges pool turns a fast, cutting current into a slow, settling lake. Each calm day is a tiny theft of storage. Operators measure the theft in cross-sections and echo soundings. Survey boats trace lines back and forth, stitching a new floor map that creeps upward each year. The delta doesn't advance like a neat wedge. It forks, braids, and stalls, fingers of silt probing deeper toward the dam. Channels that once plunged carry density currents, cold, sediment-heavy underflows that slither along the bottom, invisible from the surface, decisive in where the mud stops. They arrive on rain pulses, then rest, leaving a stealth layer that wasn't in last month's model. Every ton that settles is a ton that isn't in the flood cushion. Flood control relies on empty space. Power relies on a full head. Sediment squeezes both. The rule curves try to make peace, draw down before the wet season, time a scouring release when tributaries deliver colder, heavier water that can be coaxed along the bottom and out. But a perfect flush wants perfect timing, the right temperature stratification, the right inflow, and the right politics. Miss any piece and you simply stir the pool, scuff the turbine intakes, and watch the delta shrug. Down in the galleries, turbine crews feel the shrugger's grit. Runners built to carve water begin carving sand. Cavitation meets abrasion. Edges that were sharp soften. Efficiency falls a point, then two. Inspection windows reveal pitting like smallpox around the blades. Epoxy patches by months, sometimes a year. But every repair means a turbine offline, a report upstairs, a question about why output dipped when headlines say capacity is unmatched. Maintenance debt accrues in slogans like, "within design tolerance." The intakes, once deep in clean water, find themselves tasting silt more days than the plan liked. Screens clog, vortex suppressors hiss. You can throttle, but throttling reduces flow, and flow is money and megawatts. On silt-thick weeks, operators juggle, run fewer units harder to keep velocities high enough to discourage settling in the penstocks, rotate downtime so no single runner takes the worst of it, pray for a cold front that sharpens stratification and opens a flushing window. Flushing itself is a bargain no one enjoys. Scour too gently and you rearrange the problem. Scour hard and you send a brown wall downstream that shocks fish, smothers spawning grounds, and silts ports that weren't budgeted for sudden dredging. Estuary pilots radio depth anomalies, cranes sit idle while dredgers chew at channels that were clear last quarter. Insurance adjusters get good at the phrase, unusual siltation event. The costs spread thin and wide. Municipal intakes clog an hour earlier each day. Water treatment plants pivot to backwash cycles that wear filters faster, and exporters count the lost days as stacks of containers lean against a timetable the river doesn't respect. Upstream tributaries feel it too. Backwater from the raised pool pushes up small rivers, slowing them enough to drop their own loads at the mouth. Villages that were above normal high water suddenly sit at the edge of a new muddy shelf. Drainage ditches reverse in heavy rain, and fields learn a new habit of staying damp. Maps lag reality by a season. Compensation forms lag maps. Navigation adapts in pencil and swear words. Barges tiptoe over bars that weren't there last year. The channel migrates toward a bank armored for yesterday's alignment. Dredgers arrive, eat a path, and leave a wake that collapses back into the cut weeks later. Pilots trade coordinates that sound like rumors until a hull kisses the bottom and the rumor writes itself in steel. All of it compacts into one simple arithmetic. The effective storage shrinks, not by a dramatic cliff, but by centimeters and meters carried in by a million storms. Operators start summer closer to the top. When the sky turns generous, there's less room to maneuver. Pre-release would help, but each pre-release chisels at confidence downstream and threatens power targets upstream. So the cushion becomes a performance, tight and polished, until the river asks for a little more space than you saved. Inside the control room, Sediment shows up as constraints. Don't open gate 17 too wide. The jet peels where the concrete patch is new. Avoid long spill sequences at velocity X. The downstream plunge pool is shoaling. Hold the pool here for 2 more days so the dredger can finish the bend. Every note is rational. Together, they make a lattice of can'ts around a job that needs clean, simple yeses when clouds stack. Engineers warned about this in dry language: trapping efficiency, sediment budgeting, delta front migration. The reality is more tactile. Filters clog before lunch. A hoist cable hums with a note you don't like. A fisherman anchors in a cove that used to be a channel. And a manager runs a finger down a column labeled live storage and frowns at how small the number looks with the wet season just a week away. Therefore, operators are cornered. They lean harder on gates and runners that already carry scars. They time releases to minutes when storms don't care about minutes. They treat sediment like a maintenance problem on a hydrology schedule, but mud keeps its own calendar. And while everyone is busy translating that slow knife into spreadsheets and memos, the next storm system is already forming, ready to test how much cushion is left when the knife has carved for years. Mechanical fatigue and maintenance debt. By the time operators felt cornered by sediment, the metal started keeping score. Spillway gates live between water and air, where turbulence chews and vibration writes its own diary. Hinges, those big trunnions, rotate thousands of times in a season of fickle storms, each cycle pushing grease aside, inviting grit in, and asking welds to trust yesterday's heat. Under asymmetric flows, the leaf twists a little, not enough to show in photos, just enough to shift the load path into places designers hoped would stay quiet. Cavitation had already pitted the chutes in earlier floods, and repairs left a quilt of patches. Water loves edges. Jets hunt imperfections, curl around resin, and set up micro-eddies that hum in frequencies you only hear if your accelerometer is listening. Gate 17's tone deepened with discharge, a double peak that suggested uneven pressure across the leaf. Maintenance logged it, circled a window in the shoulder season, and moved on because the calendar didn't blink. Flood readiness meant you couldn't take too many lanes down at once. Hoists feel this pressure as well. Motors and gearboxes that lift hundreds of tons rely on teeth meshing clean, on shafts staying true. Tiny misalignments become heat. Heat becomes wear. Inspectors sample oil, looking for glitter that says steel is moving where it shouldn't. A little glitter is normal. A little more is a meeting. But meetings ask for downtime, and downtime competes with headlines that favor all systems available. So teams swap filters, top up lubricant, tweak torque limits, and promise the big fix later. Down in the powerhouse, the runners tell a similar story. Turbine blades chase efficiency curves that assume clean water. Sand dulls the leading edges, cavitation chisels pits, and the flow starts to separate in ways that shake the hub. That shake travels up the shaft, past bearings that have their own wear budget. A 1% drop in efficiency looks small on a dashboard. Multiplied by dozens of units, it's lost megawatts, lost revenue, and a reason for questions you don't want to answer in July. The workaround is to rotate units, give the worst hit run a rest, run a cleaner one harder, but rotation is a bandage, not a cure. Fatigue hides in repetition. Welds at hinge ears, gussets on gate ribs, brackets on aerators, they pass visual inspection until a hairline opens where paint bubbles first. Ultrasonic testers trace echoes and find a reflector that wasn't there last year. The repair order is simple: stop, grind, weld, stress relieve, recoat. The operational order is harder: which day, which gate, which risk. Every choice narrows options for the next storm. Nobody wants to be the person who pulled a gate just before the forecast shifted wrong. Deferred overhauls stack into debt. The list grows: swap a worn trunnion bushing, replace a hoist brake lining glazed by heat, resurface a chute panel that hums at a touchy discharge. Individually, none of these are scandals. Together, they create regimes to avoid. Operators whisper them like superstitions. Don't hold the leaf at that partial opening where the flow breaks. Don't mix gate 15 and gate 17 at high head. They set up a cross-jet that rattles the bridge. Don't run Unit 3 and Unit 7 together on silt-thick days. The penstocks sing. Supply chains add grit to the gears. When a specialty alloy seal or a precise bearing race comes from a foreign vendor with export paperwork attached, delays aren't measured in days. Domestic substitution is possible, but metallurgy is an art that punishes almost right. A part that meets static strength can still fail under the whispering hammer of resonance. Crews learn to tune around a component's personality, changing ramp rates and opening sequences to keep it out of trouble. That tuning costs time, and storms don't pay waiting fees. The grid's demands multiply the strain. Hot nights, high loads, and a political need to avoid blackouts push turbines to stay online when they should cool. Quick starts and stops fatigue generator rotors and stator windings. Surge arresters take one more spike. Control valves cycle more often as operators trim flows to chase frequency. Each cycle is a click on an odometer that nobody puts in the press release. Inspections become theater and triage. A scheduled outage wins a glossy photo of workers in hard hats. The unscheduled cut into peak discharge earns calls. Teams do real work, dye-penetrant tests on welds, torque checks on bolts, laser alignment on shafts, but they do it with a stopwatch running. Lift the leaf, set the blocks, lock out, tag out, test, sign, clear. The safest culture in the world still bends when the river climbs fast and a city calls. By late season, the pattern hardens. Operators run with the defects they understand and fear the ones they haven't met. Vibration signatures look familiar until they don't. A resonance that lived at one discharge slides as a patch wears. A brake that always held slips in humidity. A seal weeps on a night you need it dry. You can design redundancy, but redundancy was priced and purchased for scenarios that didn't include policy delays and climate whiplash playing tug-of-war on the same week. So the maintenance ledger closes each year with promises. We'll replace that bushing, we'll rotate those runners, we'll grind that weld back to clean metal, we'll order the good bearings now. And then the forecast app pings, the grid calls, and a decision squeezes through the few gates everyone trusts most. The machine keeps turning, not because anyone is reckless, but because the system is built to prefer motion over confession. That preference is how fatigue gets a head start. Seismic and landslide shock scenarios. The mountain doesn't need an earthquake to move. It just needs a reason. Draw the reservoir down fast after weeks at a high pool and slopes that were quietly buoyed by water lose their crutch. Clay seams swell and then shrink. Tension opens where compression once held. On a nameless inlet upstream, a hillside the size of a stadium can decide to settle all at once. When it hits the water, it doesn't splash, it punches. The impulse wave runs outward in rings, then funnels into the main channel like a sprinting animal, low, fast, and mean. Reservoir managers know this because the Yangtze has shown its teeth before. Historic slides at Zintan and along the Khingan River through waves that climbed far higher than a casual observer would think possible. Those were smaller pools, different banks, different triggers, but the physics rhymes. The shape of a cove, the angle of a slope, the depth of the water change any, and the wave's height multiplies or vanishes. You can map hazards, drain slopes, and net loose rock. You can't stop gravity when geometry lines up. Now fold in the other stressor, a quake that doesn't make headlines, just a mid-5 on a nearby fault while the reservoir sits fat and warm in late summer. The added weight of the impounded water has already nudged the stress field. Pore pressures in fracture networks are elevated. The quake arrives as a jolt, short and sharp. Structural engineers designed for this, mass, reinforcement, ductility in galleries, spillway piers shaped to shed force. A gravity dam won't snap from a moderate quake. But you don't live only at the crest. You live in joints, gates, galleries, and slopes. During the shaking, a gate leaf rattles in its guides. The hoist brake kisses, then holds. A weld at a rib that was already carrying more than its share ticks forward a millimeter. A drainage gallery sheds a puff of cloudy water, fines dislodged by vibration. None of this is cinematic. All of it matters when 2 hours later, the inflow ticks upward and you need the system to act like a piano with every key tuned. Landslides don't wait for permission. A quake can be the tap that sets a preloaded slope moving. Drawdown can be the same tap. Imagine this sequence. The reservoir is high after a hot month feeding air conditioners. Forecasts hint at rain but not certainty. Operators delay pre-release because the grid is humming and the last storm missed. Then a local event, thunderstorms training over a single sub-basin, spikes tributaries into the pool. Operators open a careful spread of gates to keep velocities in a safe band. The lake rises anyway. Upstream, a monitored slope shows a little creep on inclinometers. The data system marks yellow. No phones ring. At 3:12 a.m., that slope lets go. Not the whole flank, just the part that mattered. The slide hits the water in a narrow bay, throwing a wave that slaps the opposite shore, rebounds and focuses in the main stem. By the time it reaches mid-reservoir, it's lower but still enough to ride up docks and tip a fuel barge. Sensors on the dam's face register a transient pressure pulse, a spike that lasts seconds and then blends back into the broader climb. In the navigation lock, mooring lines snap and a tug lists hard before recovering. The event was small in the scheme of things. It handed the night a complication it didn't need. Here's the harder version. The quake is bigger, or the slope is larger, or it happens at high pool with gates already near their preferred limits. Impulse waves stack with wind setup and the slow swell of flood. Overtopping, normally a far red line scenario, edges into the conversation for non-overflow blocks that weren't meant to see water roll over them. Even a minor pour there isn't just wet concrete. It's scouring downstream aprons and undercutting places you want quiet. Operators have plans for this. Emergency drawdown, staged openings, turbine bypasses, but plans assume time. Waves don't. Every decision runs through a chain. The control room wants to open more faster. Someone up the chain asks for confirmation. Meanwhile, asymmetric flow across a suspect gate adds vibration in the one regime maintenance flagged to avoid. The safe gates are already wide. The next safest is the one humming. Do you take it? If you don't, the reservoir eats centimeters you can't spare. If you do, you risk compounding stress on a hinge with a weld-U-D plan to replace in October. Downriver, levees built to a different era's budget see pressure rise. Backwater creeps into urban nodes that drew confidence from maps. Emergency managers debate waking neighborhoods. The call should be simple, it rarely is. In a composite crisis, quake plus slide plus flood, warnings need clarity and speed. Information control, honed for calm headlines, slows both. This is why scenarios scare professionals more than singular threats. It isn't the quake or the slide or the storm. It's the order they arrive in, the way one turns a manageable problem into a row of falling tiles. A reservoir drawn down slowly can cushion. A gate fleet maintained with time and parts can breathe energy without humming itself apart. A hillside watched and drained can be persuaded to nap through the season. But a hot grid, a tight pool, a midnight tremor, and a slope that chooses that moment to move. Those are the combinations that turn margins into myths. You don't need failure to get harm. You need enough chaos to force bad choices fast. And on nights when earth and water both lean in, the system proves whether its redundancies are real or only rehearsed. The Cascade Model, from alarm to black swans. Here's how a bad night becomes a month that markets remember. It doesn't start with collapse, it starts with inches. Step 1, the inflow graph bends up sooner than the forecast said. Sediment has already stolen storage, so the live cushion is thinner. Pre-release was delayed by grid demand and optics. Operators open a careful spread of trusted gates to stay inside vibration-safe bands. The lake still climbs. The numbers don't explode. They creep into a zone where every additional centimeter shortens options. The first alarm isn't a siren. It's a quiet change in tone. We're closer than we should be for this hour. Therefore, step 2, a gate stutters. Not jammed, just not smooth. Gate 17's signature double peak shows up at a discharge that used to be clean. The leaf might be seeing asymmetric flow as the patch chute reshapes eddies. The hoist takes a little more torque. Operators trim to avoid the resonance, but trimming concentrates more flow through neighbors. The pattern breaks symmetry, and symmetry is how a dam breathes under stress. You can work around one fussy gate. You pay for it with narrower lanes. Meanwhile, step 3 unfolds downstream where levees live on old budgets. With the reservoir releases stepping up at night to chase the inflow, backwater rises into low-lying neighborhoods. A secondary levee near an industrial park, packed with warehouses and solvent tanks, sees seepage that turns into piping. The first sand boil appears in a floodplain yard at 1:40 a.m. by 2:15, a section slumps. Water takes the gap. What was supposed to be sacrificial containment becomes a sluice that pours into urban nodes built for sunny day maps. Emergency managers scramble to reroute traffic and power. The city switches pumps on in a dozen underpasses that were never meant to meet a river. The dam adjusts, therefore. Step 4 hits from the side. An upstream slope, preloaded by weeks of high pool and nibbled by drawdown, decides to move. The slide is compact but fast, throwing a short, hard wave that rides with wind setup and the slow swell of flood down the long reach. At the face, sensors catch a pulse. It's within limits, but it slaps the schedule. Operators had a plan to stage gates in a safer sequence. The pulse says now. They open a little more, a little faster, into the regime maintenance warned about for a gate that needs a kinder touch. The jet hums, the hinge warms, it still works. But now every minute in this band adds to the tab you hope to pay in October. What nobody has room to process in the moment is that these aren't separate events. They braid. The overtopping risk doesn't sit at the crest yet. It lurks at the non-overflow blocks that weren't meant to see sheets of water roll them. The path to true overtopping isn't a single storm. It's a stack. Less storage, slower drawdown, a wave that trims freeboard where you want margin, and a gate fleet running in a pattern that multiplies vibration into fatigue. Everyone knows the red lines. The anxiety comes from the amber ones turning orange together. Step 5 is the grid. As releases ramp up, turbines cycle to manage frequency, while spillways take more energy. A thunderstorm knocks a transmission corridor with a tree fall a county away. Load sheds in a cascade through protective relays, tripping units and forcing a reshuffle. Rolling blackouts spread across provinces that expected hydropower to smooth the heatwave. Factories pause, then call brokers for diesel and LNG. Diesel inventories were tight already. LNG cargoes reroute at a price. The energy crunch breathes on a market wired to weather. Therefore, Step 6 walks from rivers to ports. With the river running hard and turbid, navigation windows narrow. Barges queue at locks that pause between surges to keep moorings safe. Containers stack inland. Rail tries to pick up slack, but shares tracks with coal trains chasing the blackout. Exporters of electronics wait on components that were supposed to float through this corridor. Farmer buffers erode. Automotive plants hit just-in-time limits. Insurance adjusters ask whether this is act of God or operational decision, because language controls payouts. Premiums move in real time. Meanwhile, something else is happening across screens. Satellite rainfall estimates and AIS ship tracks don't match the calm tone of official bulletins. Social feeds carry videos of a night release chewing at a downstream bank that wasn't supposed to be undercut. The clips vanish and reappear mirrored. Traders watch river gauges as if they're yield curves. The yuan wobbles. Capital looks for side doors. The story that was supposed to be local becomes a map in boardrooms from Singapore to Rotterdam. Here's where a black swan can land. It isn't a mythical bird. It's a surprise born from coupling. A stuck gate isn't fatal. A levee breach isn't fatal. A landslide pulse isn't fatal. A grid trip isn't fatal. A port backlog isn't fatal. Line them up in the wrong order, and you've built a machine that makes decisions for you. The control room no longer chooses the safest regime. It chooses the least dangerous one available this minute. The least dangerous choice still has teeth. In the aftermath of a long night, the headlines will say the dam held. That can be true. The question that will take longer to answer is what else gave way to make that sentence possible. Which banks, which welds, which budgets, which assumptions? The cascade model isn't cynical. It's a way of seeing how small frictions become big outcomes when a system is tight and proud. And if you're asking how a single storm becomes a geopolitical event, this is how. The river pushes a dam, the dam pushes a grid, the grid pushes factories, factories push supply chains push currencies, currencies push politics. Water doesn't care about any of that, but people do, especially the ones who woke to wet floors and dead screens while a structure upstream proved it could still stand, at a price that isn't on any monument. Information control versus crisis management. While water argued with steel, another current moved through meeting rooms, the need to keep the story calm. Central command valued narrative stability. Markets breathe easier when sentences are smooth. The control room valued minutes. That tension shaped every call. The first instinct was to narrow the circle. Situation reports went up with softened verbs, adjustments, fluctuations, transient anomalies, words that bought time. Engineers asked for authority to pre-release beyond the guideline. The reply asked for confirmation, then for a second confirmation. Approvals climbed floors, traded signatures, and lost minutes they couldn't spare. Provincial and municipal lines frayed under that delay. Upstream counties wanted releases early, downstream cities wanted guarantees that riverwalks would stay dry through the night. Coordination calls ran long. Evacuation language got split into versions: prepare to move in one district, await further guidance in another. Residents compared screenshots. Confusion did the rest. International eyes didn't wait for press conferences. Weather satellites painted rain totals in public. AIS showed ship clusters holding position between surges. River gauges run by research teams published numbers that didn't match the evening bulletin. The gap wasn't huge. It was enough for analysts to model their own discharge curves. Insurance desks noticed. Commodity traders noticed. Information, once centralized, had too many mirrors to manage. Inside the ministry, the calculus was familiar. Rolling blackouts can be framed as prudent load management. Sudden releases cannot. So planners leaned on the safer press line. Elastic deformation within limits. Routine dispatch. Coordinated flood control. Each phrase landed like a sedative. Meanwhile, operators needed the opposite, a jolt that cleared the way to act fast without risking careers. On the river, that lag carried costs. A town that should have staged pumps at dusk waited for the green light and started at midnight. An industrial park that needed sandbags by the afternoon shift got them after dinner. None of these misses were televised. They lived in basement sump pumps that failed 15 minutes too late. As the night stretched, radicals in the data tried to speak. A slope sensor upstream sent a rate of change flag. The threshold for escalation was set to filter noise. It filtered this, too. By the time a human saw the trend, the slide had already thrown its wave. No catastrophe, just another shove against a system running narrow margins. Then markets made their own weather. Coal futures ticked up on rumors of hydropower curtailments. LNG spot prices jumped a notch when two coastal plants reported lower than planned intake. The yuan softened on a whisper that capital controls might tighten if the story worsened. Messaging hardened accordingly. Supply stable, grid resilient. But ships at anchor and darkened factory windows told a different tale to anyone looking out the window. Foreign firms didn't argue, they acted. China +1 plans that lived in slide decks moved into procurement orders. A component that used to route through Wuhan shifted to Ho Chi Minh City. A farmer intermediate got a second supplier in Gujarat. None of that showed up in morning headlines. It showed up a quarter later as a dip in export receipts and a hitch in payrolls along the river. Insurance modeled the mess in real time. Was the levee breach a natural peril or a maintenance failure? The answer moved money. If it was act of God, claims paid one way. If operational decision, another. Underwriters adjusted premiums for river-adjacent facilities across the basin. Ports braced for higher costs. Municipalities learned what the word deductible felt like when applied to a skyline. Meanwhile, the censorship machine did what it does well: scrub, delay, distract. Videos of night releases chewing at a bank disappeared. A story about a heroic crew fixing a pump took their place. But erasing evidence in one feed only drove it to another. Overseas Chinese forums filled in gaps. Satellite hobbyists overlaid rainfall on discharge and posted charts. The tidy narrative developed seams. The feedback loop tightened. Fear of spooking markets slowed decisive moves. Slowed moves worsened outcomes in small local ways. Those local outcomes leaked back into markets, raising the cost of delay. Engineers caught between instruments and inboxes felt the squeeze most. Risk management needed early action under uncertainty. Narrative management needed certainty before action. A few voices tried to break the loop. A deputy chief wrote, "Authorize pre-release at -1 sigma. We can explain prudence better than we can explain surprise." It was a clean sentence. It was also a gamble in a system that penalizes false alarms more than near misses. The approval came, but late, after the second storm cells slid down the ridge. By dawn, the dam still stood, the grid limped, and the press line held. The price was spread across 1,000 small hurts, a shopkeeper with wet stock, a welder fixing a humming hinge, a mayor answering questions about a map that was supposed to be safe. In the ledger of that night, information control won the headline. Crisis management paid in minutes that won't come back. Global shockwaves. By breakfast in Shanghai, the story had already jumped borders. Export schedulers opened their dashboards and saw red. River barges that should have fed container terminals were stacked behind lockholds, and the knock-on hit factories that run on just-in-time like lungs run on air. A smartphone plant missing 2 trays of camera modules can't ship half a phone, it ships none. Warehouses in Hamburg and Long Beach refreshed ETAs that slid from days to weeks, and procurement teams moved from emails to phone calls that began with, "What can you deliver? Not what we ordered." While that was happening in New York, retailers pulled forward orders they'd planned for fall, betting that paying more now was cheaper than empty shelves later. Air freight quoted rates that felt like ransom, and still the slots filled. The premium cargo chips, pharma vials, high-value sensors moved to wings. Bulkier goods queued behind them, turning supply chain from a diagram into a set of trade-offs scribbled on whiteboards. Energy markets picked up the echo. Hydropower curtailments meant more coal on rails and more gas at terminals. Asian buyers bid LNG cargoes away from Europe, with cents that turned into dollars, and winter risk models updated in real time. Emissions ticked up not because anyone wanted them to, but because turbines offline upstream meant boilers online downriver. Climate negotiators, preparing for a summit, found themselves rehearsing new lines about resilience while watching a graph of CO2 nudge the wrong way for reasons that began with rain and gates. The Belt and Road felt the tremor through paperwork. Chinese lenders managing projects in Africa and South Asia fielded calls about delayed equipment shipments, steel orders pushed, transformers waiting on components trapped inland. Construction timelines slipped, and project risk committees asked whether to extend grace periods or call defaults. Debtors leveraged the moment. If the creditors' factories are down, surely the timeline can flex. Deals that once rode on political momentum now met the arithmetic of backlogs. Insurers recalculated on the fly. Inland ports along the Yangtze and coastal hubs tied to its rhythm saw premiums inch upward. Actuaries fed new priors into catastrophe models that weren't built for policy delay under compound hydrology. A clause here, a rider there, and suddenly moving a box through central China cost more than last quarter. Those costs didn't stay in ledgers. They climbed into sticker prices on shelves oceans away. Upstream neighbors watched with a different eye. In the Mekong Basin, ministers whispered about cascade risks and whether their own dams could handle the combination of droughts and dumps coming fast. In India, planners reviewing projects on the Yarlung Tsangpo turned the pages slower, hearing the subtext. Big promises pinned to rivers can turn brittle when the climate rewrites odds. Technical delegations that used to trade smiles traded spreadsheets with more questions in the margins. Shipping lanes felt the shift like a bruise. With river output unreliable, coastal factories leaned harder on seaborne inputs, rebooking containers and jamming schedules. The Malacca Strait took on a little more than it liked, tugboats dancing in tighter corridors while schedules tightened like strings. A minor fog delay in the strait now rippled as lost days in Los Angeles. Brokers started quoting Yangtze risk, the way they quote monsoon windows or typhoon seasons, sliding surcharges into contracts that pretended not to notice. Commodity markets turned the story into price. Copper cathodes waiting for barge transfer idled in sheds. Futures read the pause as tightness and moved higher. Rare earth processors rattled by power cuts rationed output. Magnet makers from Osaka to Munich spun procurement wheels faster. Grain shipments from inland silos timed to river flows missed slots. Buyers in Egypt and Indonesia hedged elsewhere. A river event became a spreadsheet of decimals that added up to political headaches in places far from the gorge. Meanwhile, foreign firms ran drills they'd named a year ago and hoped never to use. China +1 wasn't rhetoric anymore, it was a routing change in ERP systems. A component that turned left to Chongqing last month turned right to Chonburi this month. It didn't happen overnight. It happened one purchase order at a time, each defended as temporary, each eroding the gravitational pull of a river corridor built to be inevitable. Diplomats tried to sand the edges. Statements framed the disturbance as weather, the response as orderly, cooperation as ongoing. But satellite feeds undercut soothing adjectives, and shareholders asked tougher questions on earnings calls. "What's your exposure to central China?" became a standard line, followed by, "How fast can you diversify?" Boardrooms that used to think in quarters started thinking in geographies. There was a quieter shock, too: trust. For years, global planners banked on a story: China's Great River harnessed, a corridor that turned inland cities into export engines, a grid that smoothed peaks. The dam symbolized that certainty. A single night of compressed decisions didn't break the symbol, it cracked the glaze. When a symbol loses gloss, capital gets selective, not punitive, careful. Care shows up as a higher hurdle rate, a tougher insurance audit, an extra supplier onboarded in a country that doesn't share a watershed with the Yangtze. In the weeks that followed, ships cleared, factories caught up, and graphs settled. But calendars kept a note. This is what it looks like when one structure upstream teaches the world how many threads tie to a gate you can't open fast enough. The river reached the sea, and the shockwaves kept going. The reckoning inside China. Morning brought a question nobody wanted in print: what broke and what was only bent. The inquiry teams arrived with clipboards and phrases that soothe. Lesson learning, process improvement, extraordinary weather. Engineers knew the pattern, root cause analysis that stopped one layer short of the root. Still, the night left marks that memos couldn't sand away. A welded rib logged for October suddenly needed June. A levee breach traced back to a funding line cut 3 budgets ago. A yellow threshold on a slope sensor became a case study in why yellow sometimes needs teeth. Lame moved in circles. Local cadres pointed to late approvals, ministries pointed to local execution, Hydropower managers pointed to climate volatility, climate desks pointed to catchment changes and upstream coordination gaps. The circle would have closed neatly, except for one stubborn fact: the people who mopped their floors at dawn didn't care about circles. Mayors walked those blocks. They knew which pumps failed, which maps lied, and which phone calls came back with "await further guidance." That knowledge has a half-life, but for a while it sharpens reforms. Hydrology standards entered the room. Design storms built from the past no longer fit a present with fatter tails. A draft proposal surfaced to update PMP baselines and require wider freeboard on critical reaches. Quietly, some argued to redefine acceptable risk around compound events, rain plus slide plus policy delay. The change sounded technical. It was political. Adopting it meant admitting that the promise of control had been priced too cheap. Transparency, the word nobody loves to own, got a trial balloon. A pilot program would publish near real-time discharge curves and gate schedules to downstream counties. The pitch framed it as co-production of safety. The subtext said, if everyone sees the same graph, decisions move faster. Not everyone approved. Narrative managers warned of panic and rumor. Engineers countered with a simpler fear: silence breeds worse rumors. The compromise landed in the middle: more data, delayed by an hour, wrapped in annotations that softened the edges. Maintenance funding, long the budget's stepchild, stepped forward. The ledger of deferred overhauls became a list with dates, not wishes. A handful of big-ticket fixes, trunnion bushings, chute resurfacings, runner swaps jumped the queue. Procurement teams were told to find parts before storms, not after. That required foreign orders in a climate of export frictions. The answer was 2 tracks: pay the premium for proven components now, and money for domestic foundries to close the gap for later. Everyone knew metallurgy doesn't bend to policy speed. They did it anyway, because waiting wasn't an option. Resettlement returned as an ache. Families like Mr. He's had new apartments and old ghosts. Compensation had been a one-time payment, a clean line in a spreadsheet. The floodplain's new habits made that look naive. Second compensation, petitions gathered signatures. Officials reviewed them with caution. Opening that door sets precedents that walk. A small program launched quietly: microgrants for adaptive works, raising thresholds, fitting backflow valves, moving a pump house 10 meters uphill. It wasn't justice, it was motion. On the grid side, diversification shifted from slogan to sequence. Planners dusted off pumped storage projects shelved as nice-to-haves and stamped them urgent. Coastal nuclear won backers who argued that inland hydropower shouldn't carry summer peaks alone. Offshore wind zones got faster interconnects to bleed volatility into batteries instead of rivers. None of this relieved the next storm season. It planted stakes for the one after. Culture, harder to measure than kilowatts, moved a notch. The triumphal posters of concrete taming a river felt dated after a night when the river wrote the schedule. New slogans tested softer verbs: steward, adapt, share. In university labs, graduate students modeled managed drawdown corridors and dynamic rule curves, with social costs included. In provincial offices, a few mid-level officials practiced saying, "We are lowering now because odds justify it," and held their breath while the comments rolled in. That still left the question that haunted the inquiry rooms. Was it a $30 billion lie? The easy answer was anger. The harder one was arithmetic. The dam delivered power, navigation, and a floor under floods that used to kill by the 100,000. It also concentrated risk, starved deltas, and trained a country to believe in a straight line drawn across a river with curves. Failure didn't need collapse. It could be chronic underperformance, brittle margins, and a governance habit that prized certainty over agility. Back in the control room, a night shift operator taped a new note above the console: "Authority follows forecast." It was a small rebellion, a plea for permission to move early when the odds lean. If that sentence survives the next quarter's politics, the reckoning will have left more than reports. It will have left a reflex. And reflex is what matters when the next line of storms decides to test whether lessons learned can run faster than water. What failure really means here. We are back in the control room, but the question's bigger than a night of bad odds. Failure here isn't only a headline about concrete cracking. It can be a quieter thing that stretches across years, targets missed by inches, margins shaved to zero, and a promise that costs more to defend than anyone admits. Start with the original pledge: tame floods, power the grid, open a hive of ships, and anchor a national story about mastery. On paper, the graphs were clean. In practice, the river taught its own classes. Flood control wasn't a binary. Holding water upstream protected one city while lifting levels in another. Backwater crept up tributaries, turned fields into marsh, and asked farmers to carry a risk the river once spread. The new line between safety and sacrifice wasn't drawn by a storm. It was drawn by a rule curve that tried to please everyone and pleased the river least. Power told a similar tale. Megawatts flowed, and still the turbines chased a moving target. Sediment dulled blades. Maintenance windows slipped. Efficiency dropped a point at a time until the gap between nameplate and today became a kind of permanent weather. Hydropower's promise is flexibility: lean in during peaks, rest in lulls. But the tighter the margins, the less flexible the machine became. Nights that needed agility got workarounds. Workarounds are where systems show you their limits. Navigation moved forward and sideways. Locks lifted ships that once fought rapids. Freight moved inland faster, then learned new weights behind surges and dredges, chewing at shoals the reservoir created. The corridor unlocked growth, but it also added a new metronome to supply chains, gates and gauge readings that factories far from the river now had to respect. When the metronome hiccuped, the music stopped. Ecology carried the cost in places without microphones. Fish that ran by seasonal signals met a flat pool with new cues. Silt that used to feed wetlands starved them downstream. Estuaries shifted. Deltas sank, a millimeter here, a centimeter there, and salt pushed a little further into places that used to taste sweet. You don't see that in a single storm. You see it when a fisherman fixes his net and tells his son the catch moved years ago and didn't come back. This isn't an indictment of concrete, it's a ledger. On one side, fewer catastrophic floods, millions of homes with reliable light, barges where there were once shoals, a symbol that stitched a country's will to build. On the other, brittleness, a system that works best when the future looks like the past, a culture that prefers certainty in a century that's laughing at straight lines, a habit of compressing risk into a single structure, then calling the compression control. So what does failure mean? It can look like chronic underperformance that nobody announces, power that's always a bit short of the brochure, flood safety that depends on split-second calls delivered through slow approvals, maintenance that's forever almost caught up. It can look like a governance style that penalizes false alarms more than near misses, until near misses teach their own lessons with interest. It can also look like success reframed too late. The dam did many of the things it said it would. The climate, the catchment, and the economy changed underneath it. The structure didn't move as fast as the world around it. That gap is the failure, less a crack in concrete than a crack in our idea that one big solution, set once, can hold a river that keeps rewriting its script. The harder truth is that resilience lives in options, not monuments. Options look messy: more room for rivers on floodplains, more small storage upstream, more transparency downstream so mayors can move people without waiting for a fax, more diversity in the grid so turbines can rest when storms demand drawdown, more money for the boring work that keeps hinges quiet and sensors honest. None of that fits on a poster. All of it works better at midnight. Back at the console, the operators aren't choosing between glory and collapse. They're choosing between narrow lanes that still promise safety if everyone moves early and speaks plainly. Failure, then, is what happens when the lanes shrink and the speaking slows. Success is the nights when authority really does follow forecast, and a river is given enough space, literal and political, to rise and fall without turning a nation's certainty into a liability. The $30 billion lie wasn't that concrete could hold water. It was that control could be permanent. The river never signed that contract. It accepted the dam as a negotiation, not a verdict. And negotiations have to be renewed, especially when the other party is the sky. That night showed the cost of certainty. The river didn't break the dam. It exposed the promise that couldn't bend. If you want to see how this story connects to the next grand project that claims mastery over chaos, watch the video queued up here. Subscribe for more true stories of power, place, and the people asked to live with the margins.